The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Al Blumkin. I'm here with my good friend David Nemec for another session of David Nemec's Baseball History and Trivia. And tonight we're going to discuss David Nemec's wonderful book about the 19th Century American Association, the Beer and Whiskey League. Welcome, David.
Well, welcome to you, Al, too. A pleasure to be with you once again.
Okay. Sabre had a meeting of the 19th Century Book Club Wednesday night, which I was unable to attend. And they did the review of the Beer and Whiskey League, but David was not able to participate, so we figured we'll fill the gap in tonight.
Yeah.
And let everybody know that this podcast is, is about the book that was discussed Wednesday night. And since I'm talking with the author, please tell us how this project came to be.
Well, first of all, I'll tell you why I couldn't be there, because I'm still back in the 19th century as far as technology goes. So this was on Zoom, and I barely got into the 20th century, and Zoom is still beyond me, so I was unable to attend. Would love to have been there and heard the discussion and been part of it. But
a lot of people our age are technologically challenged.
I know. Aren't we all? Yeah.
Yeah.
But, as far as the Beer and Whiskey League, I remember even as a kid, when I first got interested in baseball, and the 19th century was like, wow. It's hard to even believe baseball was played that early. But when I first read about the Beer and Whiskey League, I was enthralled with it. And my interest grew, I wouldn't say by leaps and bounds, but gradually over the years. And it reached a point in 1979, 78, 79, I was working on the historical text for the Ultimate Baseball book. And that started, the first section was on the 19th century. And that was where I had to do the most research before I could begin doing the text. And I fell into the research very quickly and realized how much I still did not know, and was puzzled because I wanted to find a book that was devoted exclusively to the Beer and Whiskey League, and realized there was none. And in the back of my head, I made a little file drawer, put a little card in it, and said, well, one day, maybe me. And kind of revived that when I came to my first Sabre convention, where I met you, Al. I've had a great time and a great trivia contest, and in 1991, and someone in the crowd, and I think it was Scott Flato, I really do, said, is there a book you would like to do? Have you ever thought about doing a historical book on a particular subject? And I said, actually, I have, and you've revived something in me, and that was my old memory. Yeah, I would like to do a book on the Beer and Whiskey League. And fortunately, I managed to strike a bargain with a publisher in New York, Lyons and Burford, and they wanted me to do a book on the history of the rules. And I agreed to do that if they would agree to take on the history of the Beer and Whiskey League. And that was in 1993. And they agreed to do it into a two-book deal. And not a great deal of money exchanged hands, needless to say, but certainly I fell into the project immediately, and the research was just utterly fascinating to see how this league was formed. And I've always, my story has always been that the two key figures were Opie Kaler, who was a sports writer and baseball aficionado in Cincinnati, lawyer, had legal training, and a guy named Horace Phillips, who was a hustling horse, an all-around baseball hustler who always wanted to start teams, manage them, get them going, and pocket money if he could, find a way to make deals here and there. And the two of them somehow banded together. They met one night, and met over a weekend. I'm going back without having reread the book in a while. In Philadelphia, if I'm not mistaken, and I may well be. I believe it was either Philadelphia, or may have Pittsburgh actually, I think. And they got together, and they were the only two who answered their calling, and they had struck it, sent letters to other possible baseball magnates throughout the East and Midwest, inviting to this meeting, and then formed a plot, which more or less, said, well, we had a great meeting, and it's too bad you weren't there because we're going to put together this new league, and we wish you'd been present, and why don't be sure to come to our next meeting. And they hatched this plan, and owners like Chris Bondera, Denny McKnight and Pittsburgh fell in with it. The Philadelphia team fell in with it. Phillips wanted to manage that team and take charge of it, and was aced out of it, and ultimately aced out of managing any teams at all in the first season or owning any teams, but got in later.
The New York Mets come in.
The Mets came in, and they were not part of it in '82. They were still an independent club. They were in a kind of a minor league then, and they played a huge schedule. They played over 100 games. I think they were the first team to play over 100 games in a season, if I'm not mistaken. And they were pretty much just a bunch of players, good players, and they put together their team and joined the American Association in the second season in '83 when it expanded from 6 to 8 teams, and took on a team from New York and a team from Columbus. And Horace Phillips was given control of the Columbus team, and he came in, and the New York Mets came in. And when the Mets came in, at that point, the National League, upon the death, William Halbert had died, and Halbert had kept out New York and Philadelphia after the
because they wouldn't finish their final road trips
in '76, right? And when they didn't finish, he decided he was going to get along without them, and tried his best to do it, and struggled for years. And ultimately, the league as a whole was fed up with, upon the realization that these are two of our biggest cities. We've got to get these teams back in the National League. And then Albert died. And let me ask you a question, because somebody put up in one of the Facebook groups I'm in about listing defunct teams, and he put in Troy and Worcester. And I put down that Troy became the Giants and Worcester became the Phillies. Is that correct? More or less. Yeah. Troy did become. Most of the Troy players stayed together and went to New York, and they combined. The Mets were owned jointly by Mutri and Day. Day had the controlling interest, really, and Mutri was the manager, and Mutri managed the Mets, and they brought the New York team into the National League in '83, and along with the Philadelphia team. The Worcester team did not come intact. A lot of the Worcester players abandoned, and some of them came to the American Association, and a lot of other players that come from the association from the National League prior to then, people like Harry Stovey, who became really, fine players in the American Association, and have probably been denied Hall of Fame membership as a consequence of the American Association always being regarded as a rebel league, and until really quite recently. We can go into that a little later on, perhaps this hour. But in any case, what were we discussing before that? We were discussing
just like how the league was formed.
Oh,
you say it went from 6 teams to 8 teams, and New York was New York the first place where they competed. Actually competed with a National League team.
Yeah, they were. No. Wait a minute. Philadelphia. No, Philadelphia wasn't. Cincinnati had given up the chase in the National League in 1980. Baltimore wasn't in. Yeah, Louisville wasn't in. So, yeah, they were Philadelphia and New York jointly in '83 were the first first two cities to have competing teams in the same league, and at that time, the Philadelphia team that formed in '83 in the National League was horrible. Whereas the Philadelphia Association team won the second Association League pennant, thanks in part to Stovey, and they had Bobby Matthews, and they had a number of other really good players. And it was a close race. They went out at the tail end of the season over St. Louis. And going into the '84 season, the third major league formed, the Union Association, which did not respect the reserve clause, and was masterminded by Henry Lucas, who began to, do his utmost to corral as many good players from both the association and the National League as were willing to take a chance and sign with his new enterprise. And Fred Dunlap was among them, and Dunlap reportedly got $5,000, which was an unheard of salary, and to join Lucas's St. Louis Maroons in that first season. And Lucas put together a monumentally powerful team. They had no competition really, and insofar as the pennant race was concerned in '84, whereas the American Association had a good pennant race in '83 and also a good pennant race in '84, which was ultimately won by the Mets. And that really piqued the National League's interest in the American Association and realized they had a really stiff competitor on their hands. And Day and Mutry combined forces and realized the future of baseball was going to lie in the National League. And they somewhat reluctantly, said, okay, we're going to install the best of our Mets. We're going to try and Shanghai them from the Mets and put them in on the New York team, which was going to be called the Giants. It took on the name Giants in '85 after they corralled.
Keefe was one of them, right?
Keefe, Estabrook, they were two key components. And the Giants by '85 had Buck Ewing, and they had a
Roger Connor was there.
Team. And Roger Connor was there. They had the strongest second place team in history. Their second place record would win about 98% of pennant races over the course of time. If you look at their winning percentage, was something like 750, but the Chicago team was close to 800. So the two of them ran away with the pennant.
How did the association wind up in Brooklyn?
In '84, when the American Association had 8 teams, the National League, said to the American Association, we're pretty solid here with our 8 teams, but you've got teams like Baltimore, Columbus. Are you going to really stick with these teams? Are they going to really do it for you? And you got to worry about, the Union Association going to put teams in some of the cities which don't have teams. And Brooklyn at that time was a separate city. than New York.
Yeah.
It was a huge city, one of the five biggest cities in the country.
A lot of people feel that Brooklyn made the biggest mistake in its history by in 1898 voting to unite with New York.
I think
a lot of people have.
Yeah, I think they did.
Of it. So, yeah, it was the worst move ever.
I think it might have been. It certainly changed the course of history on the Eastern Seaboard, and probably I think really nationwide when you look at the ultimate result of it. But yeah, Brooklyn was Brooklyn. They National League convinced the American League to expand the American Association to expand to 12 teams, and the association took on Toledo, and it took on a team in Washington, and it had already had the Mets, and it had Columbus, and it took on a team in Brooklyn, and the fourth team was Indianapolis, and these were not major league strongholds by any means, Toledo and Indianapolis. And Toledo was actually going to bring in the components of its 1883 Northwestern League championship team, which was a very good team, and featured the first African American player, mixed race player, Fleetwood Walker, Moses Fleetwood Walker.
Yeah.
And ultimately his brother, Welday Walker, joined the team for a few games too. And they came in as the first African American team that play African American players. And that was the American Association accepted it. The clubs were told, listen, you're gonna play these guys, and that's it. And later in the year, when the Washington team folded, it moved to Richmond, Virginia, and finished its schedule in Richmond, and called itself the Virginias. And they refused to allow Toledo to play Walker in Richmond. So he did not. By that time, he was no longer with the team, I think. At the time they made their last Eastern road swing. And
last 20 years after the Civil War.
Yeah, it was. But he never played in Richmond. And Indianapolis folded, Toledo folded, the Washington for Richmond franchise folded. Brooklyn stuck it out, and as a result of Brooklyn sticking it out, the Columbus team moved to Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh took over, the National League was forced to take on teams in Kansas City and Indianapolis and Washington throughout the 1880s, and the leagues were a hodgepodge. Each year, the composition changed, both the National League and the American Association. You never saw the same 8 teams in both leagues 2 years in a row. And that changed in 1889 after a huge fight during the winter meetings among owners in Brooklyn, Cincinnati, and Bondurant, St. Louis. And Bondurant really had most of the controls at hand, and had won 4 straight pennants and nearly won a 5th straight pennant in 1889. And Brooklyn and Cincinnati decided to pull out of the American Association and throw in their lot with the National League for 1890, and kept most of their rosters intact, whereas other National League teams, American Association teams, on the whole, lost many of their good players to the Players League, which formed in 1890. But the Brooklyn and Cincinnati team, particularly the Brooklyn team, had its entire team intact and came from the American Association, a pennant-winning team in 1889, and moved into the National League in 1890 and won the pennant again. And and this was, the only team none of the players on that team have ever made the Hall of Fame. It's the only two-time, I think, pennant winner. It's back-to-back pennant winner. There's never had a player make the Hall of Fame, nor did its manager. Bill McGonigal make the Hall of Fame. And they were a very strong team in 1890, and their move to the National League, and Cincinnati's move along with it. The American Association, once the Federal Players League folded, no longer was at a par with the National League, and was forced to fold up shop after the 91 season.
Yeah, then Pittsburgh left after 1886.
Yeah, they left after 86. Cleveland came in place of Pittsburgh, and then Cleveland went to the American Association, jumped the American Association in 87 to join the National League in 88, and Kansas City came to the National League had been the National League in 86, and they joined the American Association in 88, replacing Cleveland. And they were there in 1888, 89, and in 90, the American Association was forced to put teams in Rochester and Syracuse. Rochester
minor league team,
had a major league team for its only season ever that the Rochester had a major league team was in 1890 in any of the major leagues.
Well, Rochester had a franchise in the NBA for a number of years.
They did.
Way back when.
Way back when.
That team is now the Sacramento Kings. But the thing is also, I wanted to bring up, because I remember a while back I was looking through your 19th century encyclopedia, and I came across the 1886 Baltimore team.
Oh my God! They were.
What they hit? They hit under 200 as a team.
Not quite. No, they weren't below 200, but they were awful. But the Washington National League team was equally as bad in 1886, but it was masked in part because it had one player who was still a Class A player. That was Paul Hines. And Paul Hines, all by himself, kept the National League. I think the Washington would have been close to 200, if not below, as a team, if Hines' statistics were removed. I remember trying to do that one day, and it was close to 200. They were way down there. But Baltimore miraculously put together. They were a team in the American Association every season, except part of the 1890 season when they went and they became a minor league team, and then when they re-upped in the National League before the season was over, and then they were in the National League and American Association in 91. They were a different franchise than the one that had been in prior to folding up 10. It's 10 after the 89 season. But the Baltimore team throughout, they were a misfit, and they were contenders in 84. They finished above 500 and gave fans the delusion that they had a competitive team. But that lasted only that one season, 84. From then on, they were miserable. And they had some good players. They had Matt Kilroy, who really, with a good team in 80, if he had come with a good team in 86, if he'd gone to a team like Chicago or the Giants or even some of the better American Association teams, and not been forced to pitch every other day, or even sometimes, twice, 2 or 3 times in a row, his arm would have lasted. He probably would have been a Hall of Fame pitcher, because he was a very, very strong pitcher when he first came up, and he set the all-time record for strikeouts one season. And Toad Ramsey, who was with Louisville that season, was right behind him, nearly 500 strikeouts. And
but you wrote the Beer and Whiskey League because there was a total gap I mean, I knew a little bit about the American Association because they had the standings in the the Turk and Thompson encyclopedia. Yeah.
But as late
so
as
just
late
the standings, maybe a paragraph about its existence, but nothing. Nothing. There was an incredible gap of knowledge about that, and basically about the 19th century altogether until you came into the picture.
Yeah, I did. When I came in and did the research, I saw that there were gaps in the Big Mac too. I mean, the Big Mac didn't have the standings and the teams in the right order. And the 1891 season, they really got the Cincinnati team wrong and the standings wrong. And Milwaukee came in for briefly, and and they kind of messed it all up. And when I went over it, I corrected it, and that's when I put together the encyclopedia later on. I did have the corrected standings, and I'm sure to this day they're not really totally correct. I think there are still probably some gaps and some errors, and there were forfeited and protested games in particular. Some of them are still up for grabs. Eric Miklich and I did a book on forfeited and protested
games. Yeah, I know that. Yeah,
and that we thought we had it right, but going back over what we did, I can see where there were some games whether it's still questionable whether they were acceptable games or forfeited or protested games, and we might have missed one or two forfeited or protested games too.
You had to go through all these newspapers from back then?
We went through the newspapers back then and check, and Pete Palmer helped us a lot too. Yeah,
so, he's great. He's a great guy. Yeah.
Yeah, he is. He is a great asset, and he's so full of knowledge on so many different things that he's a go-to guy if you ever have to do any research on any of the early day stuff and the stats. And he had that little. I don't know if you remember that little thing.
Yeah.
Remember that little gadget that he came out with back? Yeah. It was like a little encyclopedia.
Yeah.
And you could carry it with you. Put it in your pocket. It was like a cell phone. And that's I don't know where it went. And I lost mine long ago, or the battery ran out, or I don't know what. But that was when he brought that out, it was a marvel at the time. And it still be a treasure today. I wish I still had it, but I don't know where it is.
Kenny Samuelson and I, years and years ago, nothing ever came of it, talked about what that little gadget was missing, certain statistics.
Yeah.
And we decided that if they ever reproduce it again, we have like games and play appearances, not stuff like whip and all the new fangled stuff that they've come up with, but just some basics that were not in there. But we discussed about this about maybe 30 years ago, so obviously nothing's become of it. But
no, it hasn't.
You were a total pioneer on 19th century, and almost everything I know about the 19th century is because of you. Between the rules.
It goes way back. It goes way back to high school for me. When I first got my first Turkin and Thompson, and went through it. I went through it, and I realized I started making cards for all the teams. Going back to the National Association, because Turkin and Thompson didn't have rosters for any.
No, they had they had the standings. Yeah. That's how I know. Boston was 71-8 in 1875. Yeah. That led to Hobart and his cohorts creating the National League.
Yeah, so I was forming. I started making cards, final cards for I realized there were gaps. They didn't have complete rosters for not only the National Association teams, but this went into the other teams in the 1880s and 90s, and even into the 20th century. There were still gaps, and Turpin and Thompson still left a lot to be desired. And Big Mac.
All I had were pitching won-loss records. All I had was pitching won-loss records and and batting averages. So you couldn't figure out. There was no mechanism to. The won-loss records you could add up.
They didn't add up at all, and the batting stats didn't add up either. You'd have the number of batters that the team pitchers faced, and the number of batters that that didn't match up with nothing matched up. And
I think the 1960s, late 1960s, was the first time that the players added up to the team, and the teams added up to the league. There was always problems.
Yeah, but then that still, as I said, wasn't true in the American Association. Even in the Big Macs in the 1980s. I remember when I was doing the Ultimate Baseball book, I looked at looking at the American Association standings from 1890. This didn't quite fit together, and I realized that there was a problem there, and that's when I started really getting interested in doing a book on the American Association, and and doing it, and I was able to do compilations along with doing stuff on players and teams and how teams were formed, and Mark Rucker contributed some great photographs. I was able to, that helped out a lot too. And of all the books I've done, I can say that was without a doubt the most fun I had doing a book. It was a sheer pleasure from beginning to end. And doing the research was a treat every day. I used to go to the public library in San Francisco, and I would hide myself in the stacks with, these reels, whatever they were called. I can't remember what they were called. Those reels, newspaper reels of film reels. And I just went, they had all the sporting news and all the sporting lives. And the sporting life did not begin until, I believe, 1883. So for 1882, I had to find New York Clippers, and I had to go back and find other newspapers to get some of the stuff from the 1882 season. But the 1883 season, they had all the box scores in the sporting life, and that went through into 91. And then the sporting news came out in 86. Microfilm. That's what they call microfilm. Yeah,
because I did a project in 1988. I presented at the Minnesota conference that year on players who lost time doing parts of 2 years from their careers, basically having to do military service during the era of the Korean War. And certain dates that I needed, so I got the library to give me the microfilm from basically the sporting news was from that particular time, and I found certain things. I was able to complete. I found out, for example, that Willie Mays tried to have his driftwood shifted from Alabama to New York, and all that did was buy him 2 months.
Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously, what I did was, very little compared to what you did, but that's everything was on microfilm, and that's how I did it. Late Dick Thompson had a microfilm reader that he bought somewhere or used, and he had a microfilm reader that he could do all his research on.
Yeah, I know. He showed it to me, and I don't know what happened to that. I don't know what Barbara did with it, but I hope she gave it to somebody who really could use it, because that was a treasure. Dick had a whole lot of stuff that really was invaluable and one of a kind. He had all of Tom Shea's letters or copies of his letters and everything, and that stuff is priceless. And
I've read. One book I read that came out a number of years ago was fairly interesting. Was on the Detroit Wolverines.
Yeah. They were.
I was always surprised Detroit wasn't in the National League of the 1890s, but then I realized that they didn't have that many people there until the auto industry started.
Right. Chicago was just one of the smaller cities. They really had trouble supporting a team, and Frederick Stearns did everything he could to perk up interest in Detroit in the years he ran the club, and ultimately had to give up after the '88 season. And it's interesting that the two clubs won pennants in the National League in the 19th century, that never appeared in the National League after 1900. And Detroit was one of them. And I remember when there was a trivia question once. I think on one of the Sabre conventions, what were the two teams? And Providence was the other team that won National League pennant, and never had a team in National League again. Well, Baltimore too, but but
Providence also won in 1879. When George Wright jumped from Boston, and that was the impetus for Arthur Soden and the reserve clause.
It was. But it was so interesting to me when I got the microfilm and really delved into it. I didn't get to do that really when I did the Ultimate Baseball book, because I had to do that. I really couldn't spend that much time in the 19th century. But when I got a chance to really sit down with the 19th century, I realized how the vernacular was so current. There were expressions that were present in the 1880s: can of corn, pop hit, there were all kinds of stuff, and the national pastime. I was seeing, you see, the national baseball was referred to the national pastime in the 1870s, and you see this stuff, and I'm looking at it, and I felt like, wow, it really would have been fascinating to be alive then, to be going to these games and be part of this scene, and what it must have been like to be a player in that era.
I've seen some. We used to go out to when you were here. We used to go out to the park on Long Island for the vintage games.
Yeah.
And see how the rules were. And there were guys who were playing vintage. Eric Miklish for one, who were quality players, and they were portraying. You were seeing what the game must have looked like. 100 years earlier, and. Because I remember watching a game under 1887 rules with the 4 strikes, and it took me and a couple of people I was with a little while to adjust to it.
I know, and there weren't any foul strikes, so
there's no gloves.
You could hit 10 foul balls and still be facing a zip count unless there had been a couple of balls thrown in among them, but
they did play 1864 rules in a couple of.
They did.
A couple of places,
Yeah, they did, and they were on fields that had some of those fields had trees on them, and you had to worry about tree limbs and so forth. And that stuff like that was actually probably on some of the fields the teams played on, even in the American Association. There were, there were ravines, there were crevices, there were, and balls would roll under carriages, and all kinds of stuff was happening then.
Yeah.
One
thing I want to ask you is why the AA went into places like Philadelphia and New York, because they had all the blue laws, Philadelphia especially.
Well, they had to.
No Sunday, no alcohol, no nothing. I mean, it took forever for Pennsylvania didn't eliminate the blue laws to a large extent until 1934.
But
even then,
they had the population.
Even then for years. Well, even then they had when they allowed in 1934, you had to stop on Sunday at 7 o'clock. That's why you had all those games that were suspended because they scheduled double headers.
Yeah, in 1890, the American Association ran into trouble again in Syracuse and Rochester with the blue laws, and they had a continual fight on their hands every Sunday. And Cleveland was also a problem city. Sometimes they would allow Sunday games, sometimes they wouldn't, and you'd have to play the games.
That's why the Robesons shifted everybody to St. Louis.
Yeah, in part.
And
but more than that, Cleveland wasn't drawing. They didn't have the drawing power. I don't know why in the 1890s. They did have Sunday baseball by then, and they just didn't draw in Cleveland. St. Louis was a bigger city and it had a richer baseball history. So get up and go to St. Louis, even though St. Louis fielded a horrible team prior to the Robertson revival. But it was the way it was, and that syndicate ownership, killed the 12-team National League and allowed the American League to take its place in history, and the failure to put teams in Philadelphia and New York allowed the American Association to go into those cities and put teams there, even though they couldn't play on Sunday, as you say, in New York and Philadelphia. They were going to get pretty good crowds to those games anyway, on Saturdays and Mondays.
Yeah.
And so they often would play a doubleheader, say, on a Saturday or a Monday, and sometimes even. And, and if they did play on Sunday, they could play, even the Americans, it was hard to find the Sunday box scores for the Philadelphia teams in the Sporting Life, because Sporting Life Philadelphia didn't play on Sunday, so at home, so you had to, if they were, it was tricky, but otherwise, the American Association by 1883, really, once they put a team in New York, made it apparent that they were going to be the equal of the National League, and they were throughout the 1880s until 1889, really. In 1889, when Cincinnati and Brooklyn moved, the bottom fell out in 90 when the Players League came in, and the American Association had to go back into Toledo, and they had to go into, Columbus again, and they had to go into Syracuse and Rochester, and they didn't have the quality of baseball. They were a poor third in quality in 1890, and in 1891, Spalding helped finesse Stovey out of the association. Stovey went to the National League. Bierbauer went from the Philadelphia AA team to the National League.
That's why Pittsburgh became the Pirates. Yeah.
Pittsburgh became the Pirates.
And, but Pittsburgh left after the AA after 1886.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, but Pittsburgh didn't. Pittsburgh was second in the AA in '86, and they were taking the makings of a good team in '87 into the National League, but the pitching rules changed in '87.
Yeah.
And their number one pitcher was Ed Morris, a left-hander. And when 1886, the guy was a 40-game winner. I mean, but you're putting him in the National League in 1887, and you're changing the pitching rules, which took away his hop, skip, and jumping around the box movements. You had to have a foot anchored and once the pitching rules changed, he was never the same pitcher again, and the team was never the same quality again. Pittsburgh became weaker and weaker year by year until 1890. In 1890 National League, they were a bottom.
They won 23 games.
Yeah, they were the worst.
All the infants. Yeah.
They if not for the presence of the Spiders in '99, the 1890 Pittsburgh team would be remembered on a par with the 1889 Louisville team as the two most awful 19th century teams once the league started regular schedules and formation.
The thing is that Barney Dreyfuss bought Louisville, and he bought the interest in the in Pittsburgh and moved another syndicate situation. He moved Honus Wagner and a few of the other, Fred Clark and a few of the others from Louisville to Pittsburgh.
Yeah. Yeah, incidentally, I don't know if we can go into this, but Chesborough was one of the guys who went, and I don't know if I posted something in Sabre-L the other day about the pronunciation of player names, and this is just as a side junket, and one of the names was Jack Chesborough. As a kid, he was always called Chesborough. And that has been changed by Sabre to Cheeseborough. And I maintain that the old pronunciation is correct. And
there's only one E in there.
Yeah, there's only one E in there. And there's this guy. You see this guy. There's this guy Chesborough, and now in the trials.
Yeah, one of the defendants of the.
And
Trump,
he maintains he had a fight for his name to be pronounced Chesborough because everybody's under the influence of Jack Cheeseborough now, and I don't think Chesborough pronounced his name that way. It was a player. And that's a sidelight, but
David Fleitz wrote an excellent biography that I read a few years ago on Eddie Seacott, and he discusses the pronunciation because of Scotty, a few other things, and the family said it was Seacott.
Yeah, and Amos Russi is another example. As a kid, I always pronounced his name Russi, and I don't. It was Frank Seeley, and now it's Seeley. And and Dan, it was Dan Brothers when I was a kid. Everybody
Brothers.
Now it's Brothers. On whose authority? I mean, who's to say? I mean, nobody corrected it in the 1920s or 1930s. It was, every sports writer then, all the sports writers I knew as a kid, or people I knew, big baseball fans in 40s and 50s, all pronounced the names that way. I don't know what, on whose authority they were changed, these pronunciations, and I question whether they should have even been changed. And,
you want to talk about the the lack of AA Hall of Famers for a few minutes before we have
that's very important. The only guy who played in the American Association any length of time who made the Hall of Fame as a player was Tim Keefe, who pitched in '83 and '84 with the New York Mets in the American Association. But Keefe went over with the Giants to the National League in '84 and pitched the rest of his career in the National League. No player who played exclusively in the American Association every year that the American Association existed has ever made the Hall of Fame. And even Bid McPhee, who went to the National League in 1889 in Cincinnati, not 1889, in 1890, starting in 1890 with Cincinnati in 1991. Through the rest of his career, played in the National League. Bill McPhee, because he played his first 9 seasons in the American Association, was not allowed and not voted into the Hall of Fame until very, very recently. He too was excluded. There have been no players who've played their entire careers. Pete Browning is the biggest example. Whether Pete Browning is a Hall of Famer is up for grabs. His batting average, everything else about him. He won 3 batting titles in 2 different leagues. He was a much better fielder than he's given credit for, a much better ball player all around, and a very sad guy in a lot of ways, what happened to him. But I maintain he should have been in the Hall of Fame long ago, but the American Association is held against him more, and plus the fact that he never played in a meaningful September game in his entire career. Never was on a team that was even in mild contention late in the going. Louisville came the closest in '84, but not that close. And
what about in 1890? They played. Didn't they play in the World Series? It was abandoned after with Brooklyn a 3-3 tie.
Yeah, Brooklyn played in the series with. They played against. Yeah, they played against Louisville in the series in 1890, and it finished in a 3-3 tie. The weather canceled the 7th game. They never did play it. And then in '91, Anson was willing. He was with Chicago in the National League. He was willing to play the Boston AA team. Boston had gone from taking their PL team and bit the heart of it into the AA rather than coming back to the National League. And those players like Bruder's brothers, whatever you want to call them, Hardy Richardson, the whole cadre of star players were headed for they won the pennant in the American Association. Anson wanted to play them, and that's another story because there's a lot of scandal still about what happened in that pennant race in 1891 and how Boston ended up coming in ahead of in the National League and refusing to play.
Two things I want to reference before we have to close. Charles Alexander wrote a book I've referred to a couple of times during our conversations called The Turbulent Seasons, where he goes very, very heavily into 1890 and 1891, and he's giving your name appears in the book a couple of times. And years and years ago, there was an author named Jerry Lanch who did a book on the postseason, the World Series, or whatever it was, in the 19th century, which was one of my first groundings in that. Yeah, he did. So you've created basically you've created a cottage industry that I think there's more interest in these things now than there was 50 years ago.
And there's so much more known now than there was. Yeah. Than there was when I was a kid. You couldn't find out a third of the information, and now you can find out just without even leaving your home. Just going online, and you find out stuff that you couldn't possibly have known back in 1950.
You're a pioneer, my friend.
Well, thank you.
Okay, we have to cut.
I'm glad to be one, and I'm glad to have been with you once again. Al, this is a treat.
Oh, it's always a pleasure, and I always wind up learning things from you.
That's great. I'm glad to hear it.
Okay.
And I really enjoy being with you again.
Give my regards to Marilyn, and hopefully we'll do one relatively soon.
Good.
Okay, you take care. Bye-bye.
You too.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.